In addition to our panelists, we've invited three distinguished observers to give their widely differing perspectives on where we go from here. They are Time magazine correspondent Sylvester Monroe, journalist and businessman Tony Brown, and Princeton professor Cornel West. Gentlemen, we do thank you for joining us. Let's begin with Mr. Monroe and the case for government assistance. I've just reviewed Sylvester Monroe's review of his own return to the school of his youth. Is there anything you wanted to add to what you've said? I might ask you about your own personal feelings as you walked past those graffiti-covered walls.
Well, what's interesting about going back there, what's painful about going back there, is people talk about these communities and how people ought to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. They ought to do that. That was a community that regularly, routinely produced successful members of society when it had the support necessary to do that. And it pains me to hear people talk about a welfare state, people who want a handout. What communities like this, what black people have always asked for, is not a handout. They are citizens of this country. What they're asking for is equal access to opportunity, to education. Government has a role. And no one is saying that government can solve all the problems there. And part of that role is to provide a quality of education that means something. That school used to have that.
Why is it that government, that the Lyndon Johnson era, which is the time I would assume you were a student at that school?
That's right.
Well, what's different then? Why can't it work now?
Well, one of the things I think that when I was a student in the Chicago public school system, never one day in the 10 years that I was a student in the Chicago public schools did I miss a day of school because of a teacher strike or because there was not enough money to keep the schools open. Perhaps that was because the Chicago public school systems were then a majority white system. The Chicago public school system today is majority minority. And so now we can't find the money anymore.
So white power fled then, or at least turned its back on
it has turned its back.
Establishment.
It has turned its back. So at the question that Paul Solomon asked at the top of this piece, why should people, and people will say to you, well, my kids don't go to that school. I don't live in that community. What does that have to do with me? It has everything to do with you. This is a democracy. We pay taxes to distribution of wealth. Right. Shared wealth in this country is one of the foundations of this country. If we don't educate those children, we can't build enough prisons. We can't rebuild LA enough times. Everyone, I understand why this gentleman feels he doesn't have a stake in this society, but everybody will pay if we don't.
How would Mr. Kozel respond to Mr. Monroe's observation, which suggests that when the white man goes, so does the power?
Absolutely. I completely agree with him. In Chicago, nothing he said was overstated. A couple months ago, the Chicago school system, abandoned by white people, not just white children, but white business, everyone, had to start rationing toilet paper. Children now have to bring it from home. It's absolute apartheid today in Chicago.
The issue is more than just money. It's also an issue of control and curriculum, and what type of African adults are you trying to produce within that school system. I was in the Intelligent and Gifted Children's program. I went to Cornell University Preparatory. I was on welfare, Head Start, free lunch, free breakfast, forced busing for integration. Every single government program ever created, I have been
here you are on the cover of Newsweek magazine. It must have worked.
That's not the point, because I talked about white people. That was why I was on the cover. They were not celebrating my academic victories.
Your point is made.
Right. So my point becomes, Phil, that how you design those programs. In all of the programs that I attended, all of the education that I had, college, public, and otherwise, nobody ever told me that I was an African woman. Nobody ever told me what the history of African people were. Nobody ever told me that America is business, and without business you will have nothing and be nothing. And nobody ever told me how to organize business so that I would be able to develop institutions in my own community. So now the sincerity the sincerity of all of the programs and all of the education has to be questioned, indicted, and convicted, because the bottom line is that America is not and has never tried to produce African adults who are functional, self-sufficient, who understand their politics, their economics, and their relationship to the world politics and the world economics.
America is never going to. America's never going to understand that as some abstraction. Communities understand that. You must give communities the power and the control, and finally address the whole point. You can't just pour money into a school. You've got to build up in the community the economic base to sustain the school. You can't deal with these problems in isolation and say, I'll have a good school in a neighborhood with no economic base and no jobs and no businesses. You want decent schools, you've got to develop the communities in which those schools exist so that you have an economic base to support them. You've got to develop the power politically so that the community will be able to control that environment in which the school exists and meet the needs culturally, value-wise, otherwise that community reflects. And that means that you've got to have power in the hands of that community as a whole. Not in the hands of education bureaucrats, not in the hands of social bureaucrats, but in the hands of the people of the community themselves.
There is a gentleman in our room who believes he has a personal account of his own experience of teaching 4th grade in the community of Roxbury, the minority community within the city of Boston. Mr. Kozel, you've been patient, sir. What are your thoughts as you listen in on our dialogue?
Well, I didn't think I'd ever agree with Alan Keyes on anything, but I sure agree with what he just said. I started teaching, as you know, in a segregated school in the mid-'60s. Today, inner city schools everywhere are more segregated and less equal than they were at the time I set out as a teacher. Inner city kids I see all over the country are in squalid, ugly, filthy, overcrowded buildings in which not one of us would willingly spend 1 hour. Their lives are more miserable today than they were when I began. By any kind of statistics, I won't drown you in statistics, but there's one which is so devastating, I have to cite it here. As you know, Phil, tracking has come back into schools again. It's become a sort of fashionable way of segregating kids within a single school. Black children, statistically, are 3 times as likely to be tracked into so-called special classes for the retarded as white children, but only half as likely to be put into gifted programs. That is an intolerable statistic in a democracy. And anybody who looks at that and all the other statistics, the fact that black infant mortality is twice that of white children, anyone who looks at those kinds of statistics, or a recent news event, black Haitians being brutally excluded from this country while white Europeans are welcomed at New York International Airport. Anyone who looks at that knows in their heart that racism remains the central moral agony of this society.
Yeah. The issue is race. Well, Tony Brown, for a talk show host, you've been unusually well behaved throughout this program, and I thank you for your patience. Do I sound like a white racist to say, see what I mean? You can pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. Does that make you nervous if I say something like that?
No, but the context would make me nervous if you were suggesting, and you're not, that all blacks had to do was to go to work, and if they worked as hard as whites, we could make it. But that's not the context in which you're saying it. The context in which you're saying it is that we are looking at a group of people, 30 million people, who this year will earn $300 billion, equal to the 14th richest nation in the world. We're 12% of the population. We buy 18% of the orange juice, 20% of the rice, 26% of Cadillac cars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have 350 black organizations, middle-class blacks, 1 million of which go to white hotels each summer. They spend $16 billion discussing white racism and black poverty. Now, there's no way in the world that white people can free black people, because freedom is not white people's to give. 2, white people, as I said in the piece, cannot do for us what we refuse to do for ourselves. 3, the key to this equation is the behavior of the black middle class. The key to this is not understanding whether or not whites like blacks or blacks like whites. I frankly have no interest in that at all. I have no interest in managed society. I'm not interested in having to sit next to people because they're white. I'm interested in being equal. And the only way you're equal is to have power. Alan Keyes said the most cogent thing said here tonight. And that is, we are talking about power, not whether or not white people have been fair, not whether they're nice people, not whether or not black people are good or bad, but whether or not you as a community of people have the instruments of defense and in some cases of aggression to protect your turf and or your interests. You can't have 30 million people handing over to another people 100% of their resources and blaming them for 100% of their problems. That is not intelligent. So what we need to do in the black community is A, decide to be competitive. And the only way we're going to be competitive is to use our resources. And the final thing I'd like to say is this. The primary resource we have as a people is not our money. It's what we know. And what you know is called human capital. And the fleet of human capital from the black community has been enormous in the name of integration. We've lost our brains to the white community, and nobody is there for the intergenerational transfer of information from middle-class people to poor people, so we now have what we call so-called underclass people.
But if what you know is that critically important, and I don't know anybody who will argue it, how is it possible, in the light of Mr. Kozol's nightmarish and brutally honest and well-researched review of the horror story of public education, especially in the inner cities, for black children to know anything?
White power structure and the white community in America are out of options. They can no longer afford racism, and they can no longer afford school systems that don't work for this following reason. In 8 years, over 50% of the population workforce will be female and non-white. In 30 years, this will be a majority numerically non-white nation. If we do not train women and non-whites to go into the workforce for high-tech skilled jobs in the next 8 years, none of us in this room is going to have a job at all. So Mr. Kozol, there's another dimension to what he is saying, and I'm sure he's more than aware of it, and that is, it is not black schools that have failed. The American school system has failed. It is not the ones who drop out that are the problem. The ones who graduate are the problem. We do not have a school system that does anything for post-secondary education, and we don't have a school system that does anything for the bottom 50%, which is why Germany and Japan are beating our brains out.
Regardless of the color of the student.
Regardless. Now, when you get to blacks, we cannot leave out of this equation the black middle class. And we cannot leave out of this equation, no matter what the government does, and the government should do something. We cannot leave out the obligation of the black middle class to transfer its wealth, primary wealth, which is human capital or information, to those in our community who don't have it.
May I ask you're a capitalist with a...
I am not a capitalist, and you said that before. I'm not interested in proving capitalism. I'm interested in using a free market system to alleviate the problems in the black community.